Hello, my name is Mark Dietrich. I am the chair of the steering committee of the Alliance for American Rule of Law, which is a group of individuals who are used to work in promoting the rule of law overseas, largely funded by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. And we are concerned by developments concerning the rule of law in this country, so we are turning our gaze to United States rule of law and having a series of discussions with people concerning the rule of law at home and abroad. And we're very pleased to be joined today by Andrew Natsios, who is a leading expert in development, previously served as the administrator of the United States Agency for International Development under President George W. Bush, and is also a leading academic in the field. He's the outgoing director of the Scowcroft Institute at Texas A&M University and a professor of public policy there as well. Thank you very much. Oh, I've also wanted to mention, excuse me, that in his prior life, Andrew Natsios served as a member of the state legislature in Massachusetts and was the chair of the Republican Party in Massachusetts. So thank you very much, Mr. Natsios, for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And I might add, this is the old Republican Party from 50 years ago. I was elected actually with Andy Card, President Bush's chief of staff, 50 years ago last November.
And we have a number of topics I wanted to get into today with you, but first, since we are mostly concerned about the rule of law in this country, and given your background in a state legislature and working at the highest levels of the American U.S. federal government, could you tell us how you think about the rule of law, how you define the rule of law, why it's important, and what you think people should know about the rule of law in the United States?
Well, the most important thing is that the rules apply to everyone. They don't just apply to some people who don't have political power, they apply to people in office and out of office, in business, in academia, and nonprofit sector, and the rules should be the same for everyone. Now, is our system always exactly right? No, but it's better than anything else. And my experience, for example, in Massachusetts, 4 speakers of the House went to jail. They were indicted, they were prosecuted under federal statutes and state statutes. They had taken bribes and they were put in jail. And this, by the way, goes through in various countries, various states around the country, goes through for both parties. No party has a monopoly on virtue. And that's the first thing it means for me. Secondly, it's the rule of law is a constraint on um, the branches of government. There's the legislative branch of government, there's the executive branch, and then there's the judicial branch. And the judicial branch sometimes is seen as enforcing the law, but it's also enforcing the law on itself, which is to say, there has to be a discipline within the judicial system of the way judges behave and the standards that they uphold and the positions they're in. I often point out to my students the most important gift the British gave us was a functioning court system that had been in existence for 150 years before the American Revolution, and we simply superimposed a national government on top of the existing court system. If we didn't have that, we would not look like we do today. We would be a poor, unstable country. Some people say we're moving to that, but I'm not that pessimistic. And I do think that we settled our governance issues and our rule of law issues first. And then later, 150 years later, we got into healthcare, for example. There was no healthcare system in the United States for the first century. In fact, it was quackery, even at the medical schools, at the Ivy League schools. A degree in medicine at Harvard Medical School 150 years ago was a joke. I mean, if you saw what they were teaching. Uh, We have done it backwards. The last sector to get developed in the development field in AID and European democracy was governance. We should have done that first. We did it last. And the weakest constituency in Washington before the destruction of aid was the democracy and governance constituency. It didn't even have an earmark. Every other sector had earmarks except for the democracy and governance, which, if you look at the literature and the practical experience of people like me, is the most important sector. There's no rule of law, there's not going to be any long-term economic growth.
So, could you talk a little bit more about that and about why USAID spent time, money, effort to support rule of law programming overseas?
Well, I'll give you an example in China, even though I never had programs there, but it's instructive. In 1980, and I don't remember the exact statistics, I think they had 5 law schools and about 2,000 lawyers because the law was not applied to everyone. If you're a member of the Communist Party or the Central Committee of the Communist Party, the Politburo, it didn't apply to you. And the party enforced the rules the way they wanted to. And the court simply was a footnote. Um, the Chinese career bureaucracy, the Confucian bureaucracy that always existed in China for 2,000 years, has reasserted itself for the last 30 or 40 years since Deng Xiaoping. And what they did was they said, we need law schools. They built 200 law schools. They went from 2,000 lawyers to 200,000 lawyers. Why did China do that? Because they realized without rules, you can't have an advanced technocratic state, and you can't have a highly advanced, efficient, productive economy. Now, China has grown rapidly, and the reason it has is because of construction. They built a lot of stuff, but they do not have strong institutions, which is why they have so many dysfunctions now. Uh, Xi Jinping has has centralized control in his own hands of all the decisions. Very bad idea. You in a functioning system, the rules should be enforced at the lowest possible level, and everybody should have a common understanding of what the rules are. If they don't, then it slows everything down. It slows decision making down. It slows investment down. It slows the delivery of public services down. It means some people the laws apply to and other people it doesn't, which is not a functional system. So the Chinese, until Xi Jinping took over, were actually moving toward the rule of law, and then that ended once he began to reestablish the dictatorship in Beijing. Now, you're saying, what does that have to do with AID? We recognized that a long time ago. And so in many countries, when I would travel, the heads of state would say, Andrew, it's nice to have health and education programs. We love the agriculture programs, but we need to improve the governance in the country. Can you help us with that? And there were no earmarks for democracy and governance programming, particularly the rule of law. We needed more money in this area, and we didn't have it. And that's one of the weaknesses of the aid system, was all dependent on these earmarks that made up 100% of the aid budget.
There may not have been earmarks, but were the programs controversial, or did Congress ever ask you about why are we doing this, or did they have bipartisan support? What was your sense on that?
There was bipartisan support for the rule of law programming, probably because a large percentage of the Congress were lawyers, and the American Bar Association was a big supporter of it. So there was support for it, and I think there was actually earmarks for the rule of law in Eastern Europe when the Soviet Union collapsed. I remember an earmark being put in place, which was good because it protected the programs. What we can't have in development is programs that last a year or two. The programs need to be 10 or 20 years long, which is what they were during the Cold War. And once the Cold War ended, the existential threat to the Western democracies was seen as no longer there. The time span for programs began to shrink. It went from 20 years to 10 years to 5 years, and some people say because of the annual OMB requirement of annual program reports for every single program every year. because many of our programs won't show results every year. It takes years to show. And sometimes, it's very interesting, we did a study of 20 years of democracy and governance programming, which included the rule of law. We had the American National Academy of Science do it with us. And I think it was Vanderbilt and the University of Pittsburgh. There are two universities.
I remember this, and I think that's correct.
Very, very important study because it looked at 20 years, $3 or $4 billion worth of programming. What effect did this have? And what it showed, and there's controversy about this, some political scientists have attacked it and all. Political scientists attack everything all the time. So I found it fascinating. What they found is a moderately high correlation between $1 spent in democracy and governance, including the rule of law programming, and an improvement in the Freedom House, which is a democracy NGO that's existed since World War II, and the Freedom House Index on Democracy, which they've been doing for long before AID even existed. Winston Churchill, I think, opened the first Freedom House meeting, 1942. And so what it showed was they do work, but they take time. And they also found another thing, which none of the academics have noticed. I read it and I was fascinated. There's a time lag. So what they'll show is no improvement in the indicators for, let's say, a 10-year program. And then all of a sudden, after the program ends, there's no more funding, no more program. In year 13, 14, 15, there are improvements every year. And the reason is it takes a while for all of the capacity building, getting people scholarships to get their law degrees in Western law schools. I shouldn't say industrial democracy law schools, not just Western, but law schools in countries that have the rule of law. Then they go back and they begin to change their own systems. I remember a couple of heads of state telling me they got their law school degrees from an AID scholarship, and they went back and they said, we now know there's a different model for how you develop. It's not the patrimonial clientelist system we have in our country. It's a rule-based system we have in the United States and Canada and Japan and South Korea and Western Europe.
But it is a challenge to measure that impact.
Yes, it is.
It's very different from the health and education sectors, for example.
And that's what I have argued, that James Q. Wilson wrote a famous book called Bureaucracy. I took him 45 years ago from a master's degree. He's since died. He's one of the great political scientists of the late 20th century. And he says in his book, Bureaucracy, that when you start trying to measure everything quantitatively instead of qualitatively with numbers, you will naturally tend toward those programs which can be measured. If it can't be measured, they stop funding it. And that's what's happened in AID. We've moved away from institution building toward service delivery, for example, in the health field. Why? Person's dead or alive. A child has survived or not survived. It's easier to measure that than it is whether there's an improvement in the quality of the rule of law through the court system.
You mentioned bureaucracy, and the current administration has decided to dismantle a lot of the existing bureaucracy, including USAID. And as that process was going on back in February and March, you were very outspoken about defending USAID. As you look back with a little time passed since this has all happened, what are your reflections on the loss of USAID? Why is that important? And what should we be thinking about as we think about what the future of assistance, and in particular democracy assistance and rule of law promotion, might look like?
Well, the first thing is I think it was an abomination what happened to AID. And what I'm troubled by are the attacks, which were bold-faced lies in many cases. I think there's too much accountability in AID. I wrote an article for the Center for Global Development, or a essay called The Clash of the Counter Bureaucracy in Development. on the over quantification of development that we did not have during the Cold War. And many of the most transformational programs we ran were during the Cold War, as a matter of fact. When people say that AID was not successful, I would argue that we would have lost the Cold War had it not been for AID. For example, the Green Revolution uh, of Dr. Norman Borlaug, the implementing agent was AID for the most part. The aid administrator gave a speech in 1970 in which he said uh, that 50% of the budget of AID was spent implementing the Green Revolution, which was a revolution that took high yield seed and distributed it, particularly in Asia. It was in Indonesia, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Thailand, India, Bangladesh. There were 300% increase in yields per hectare over a 30, 40-year period, with only a 30% increase in the amount of land. That whole program ended famine in Asia, except for China during the Great Leap Famine, which, we didn't run aid programs in China. And in North Korea, I wrote a book about the North Korean famine because they didn't follow the Green Revolution. My point is, AID has had major successes. Raj Shah started a program called Feed the Future, which was extending the Green Revolution to Africa. I think that we will have to recreate AID. I am a big fan of the State Department. I think they're the greatest diplomatic institution in the world. They are not a program management institution. Some diplomats say, Andrew, we're trying to change. I said, you may, but there's a huge clash of culture between a diplomatic institution and a project management institution, which is what AID is. And State Department doesn't have measurable indicators for everything they do, or even qualitative indicators. And I think there's a fundamental clash that's going to take place, and we'll see a lot of these programs fail. So I argued in my testimony before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, my written testimony in particular, which you can get online, that all great powers have a foreign aid program. People think that because AID was created by Jack Kennedy in 1961, that's the first time we had foreign aid program. The first foreign aid program was run by Alexander Hamilton. He was sent down to help the Haitian slave after the Haitian slave revolt throughout the French, and they said we need help writing a constitution, and they asked him to help them, and he did. It didn't work too well because of other factors that had nothing to do with Hamilton, but uh, great powers have been running aid programs for 1,000 years. The Roman roads were an aid program, in fact, that tied the Roman Empire together. The British, you should see what the British did in India during the Raj. Those were foreign aid programs. They didn't call them that, but that's what they were. We will have a foreign aid program as a great power. The question is whether it's going to be competently run, learning all of the things that we've learned in the last 60 years, what not to do. I am really afraid these people who are talking about changing the system don't seem to understand a lot of the things they've spoken about. We've been doing for a long time. Some of them work very well, some of them have not worked very well.
What do you say? And I'm sure you've had friends and family say, why is the United States spending our precious resources overseas? And we have enough problems to deal with here at home. What's the answer to that critique?
We just discovered with the COVID-19 pandemic that killed, depending on the estimate, 5 or 6 million recorded, but probably closer to 20 or 30 million if you extrapolate the figures based on the Economist's model, the magazine The Economist. The worst pandemic in world history was after the First World War, the great influenza. It killed 5% of the world's population in 6 months. We are going to have another one of those pandemics that kill much larger than the COVID-19 did. The early warning system for the world was AID. We shut down 60% of the aid, 65% of the aid staff was in the field. We had 2,500 health officers. We had a system set up for local NGOs, civil society organizations, international NGOs, contractors tied into the ministries of health in the global south to report on what was going on. That entire system has collapsed now. We don't know what's going on around the world in health. We're going to have another pandemic. You know, pandemics don't stop at national borders. If we wait till a pandemic gets to our border, it's too late to stop it. You stop it where it starts. Now the early warning system is gone. I'll give you a second example. If you had a sandwich in the last week, you were eating AID wheat in flour. Why? 60% of the wheat grown in the United States was developed by a worldwide center on agricultural research that AID helped found and is the largest donor to, the CGIAR. And there are many of these institutes around the world. One of them is in Mexico. They focus on wheat and corn. There's one for bananas in Nigeria, for potatoes in Peru, for fish farming and rice in the Philippines, for example. The one in Mexico developed a fungus resistant wheat seed, and it's public. You know, it doesn't belong to anyone. Anybody can use the seed. It was developed for the poor countries because this fungus 20 years ago was killing off the crops in the south. Our farmers said, "Can we use it too?" We did. 60% of the wheat is grown, but people don't know that, and people don't know we had this early warning system for disease. So people don't realize we share in the benefits of AID in the United States. We have now destroyed all of these systems that were protecting us. And when people say it doesn't have any, of course it has an effect on us.
How does that apply in the DRG and rule of law sector? How would you answer that question when people say, why should we be spending money training judges? Why should we have people posted overseas, living in other countries? That's expensive. Promoting the rule of law. Why is that important?
Countries that are well governed do not produce large refugee and forced migration crises across our borders. They think that they're solving all of these programs with ICE running around arresting people and all that's nonsense. It's not going to succeed, and it's more and more people are becoming angry at the abuses of ICE. And I understand there are internal problems because a lot of the officers are getting very depressed by what they're being asked to do, which and violates many federal laws and I think our legal traditions. But we can solve the border problem, but we have 2,000, 3,000 miles of ocean of seacoast. That's how people can come in. They can come in from Canada. The way you deal with forced migration and illegal immigration is you make the countries that are producing the immigration more stable. Costa Rica doesn't. Costa Rica is a middle class democracy. It's prosperous. It's stable. It's one of AID's greatest success stories in Central America. They don't produce people coming. No one's coming from Costa Rica across the border in the United States. They never were. Why? Because they're well governed. They have a rule of law. They have judges that don't get bribed all the time. They have a legislature, the parliament that works, National Assembly that works. One of the first woman president of Costa Rica is a former employee of USAID. Interestingly enough, the first woman vice president of El Salvador is a former employee of USAID. The president of Peru, the first indigenous president of Peru, went to get his law degree, no, his degree in economics. He had a PhD in economics, I think from either Stanford or the University of Chicago. He tells everybody that story. He got it with an AID scholarship. We were training judges, we were training lawyers, we were training economists, agriculture around the world. We stopped doing that. Is that wise? Those people, who's got a huge training program now, or education program? The Chinese. They now have 40,000 scholarships a year. We have nothing. We shut it down. It's a mistake. It's a mistake to do that. The rule of law and good governance produces the platform on which economic growth takes place, that produces jobs that are well paying, that create a more prosperous future. That's why we put emphasis on it.
and of course the two countries that applauded the loudest at the demise of USAID were China and Russia.
Exactly. Why is that?
You mentioned the people that in a variety of countries that USAID benefited and trained and educated. We also employed a lot of local staff in countries overseas. Uh, One of my concerns is as we have retreated from the world stage and retreated from these countries, we've left these people exposed politically. And the damage that USAID is, the departure or closure of USAID is doing in the food and medical sector is well known and well established. But fewer people think about the damage that we're doing politically by departing from these countries. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yes, I remember there's a famine in Ethiopia, and the Swedes had sent in food, and they get to the villages, and the village, thank heaven, the Americans have arrived. Whenever we have a famine, the Americans said, "We're not Americans, we're Swedes." He said, "No, no, you're Americans." Whenever there's a major crisis, the United States is always reliable. No, no, we are Swedes. And they got into a yelling match. Apparently, the Swedes told me they were really furious about it because the perception around the world is the United States was reliable when there was a crisis or when there was long-term development programs that worked, that the United States could be trusted. And now people are saying, you just shut these programs down with no advance warning and just left. And we took all of our, most of the aid staff aren't Americans. They're Kenyans or Peruvians or Nigerians or um, Jordanians, and they work for the AID missions. I think 50%, at least 50% of the workforce were what we call foreign service nationals, many of whom have degrees from American universities, Ivy League universities, I might add. And those people were all put out on the street in countries that have unemployment rates of 20 or 30%. And so that's the two areas that we don't have earmarks in: democracy and governance. I think maybe recently they put an earmark for democracy, but for 30, 40 years, we didn't have any earmarks for democracy. And we'd had no earmarks for economic growth. Those are the two most important sectors to people in the developing world. You need more economic growth, and we know how to do it, but we couldn't do it because we didn't have enough money. And we know how to do democracy and governance programs too. We didn't have enough money to do that because it was sucked off to other sectors. And I'm not criticizing other sectors. I'm simply saying there was a mismatch and a imbalance in the allocation of resources for development, and that's not good. We aren't reliable anymore, and that's the biggest damage to us now is that. I did not know this, but the health reporting systems were not just for us. The World Bank, the European Union, um, the Global Fund for Vaccines and Immunizations, all of these international, they were relied on us for the data. A lot of the data that we use in democracy and government comes from AID. It doesn't exist anymore. So everybody was looking to us. You know what's happened since we destroyed aid? Everybody else is cutting their aid budget. The British just, I can't believe a Labour prime minister on the left just announced a 40% reduction in their aid program in the UK. That was shocking to me. It happened 2 weeks after the demise of AID. So other countries are following us. The only two countries in the world that increased their aid budget were Switzerland and Japan. Everybody else is cutting their budgets.
Turning back to this country, what do you see as the coming threats here to the rule of law? And as you observe what's happening here, what worries you, and what can we, the people, do about it?
Well, the first thing I think that's very important is we need to understand it's the rule of law affects all other sectors of our society. It's not simply people who are lawyers who are affected. It's not just people who sue in court or who have a crime committed against them. They arrest a criminal and they prosecute them. The predictability of our laws and the the enforcement of laws is what allows political and economic stability and progress. And when we don't have that, things will deteriorate. So I am very worried that the erosion of the rule of law in the United States will do enormous damage to the economy over the longer term. People don't know what to expect. The reason people used to come to the United States, highly talented people, 2/3 of the people who won Nobel Prizes were immigrants to the United States. Now no one knows what to expect in terms of immigration. They don't know if an ICE officer is going to show up at their door and arrest them, even though they're American citizens. And that is having an effect on who immigrates to the United States who are highly talented. Most people who are CEOs at Silicon Valley are first and second generation Americans. We want those people here, and yet many of them are leaving because the rule of law is no longer guaranteed in the United States, unfortunately. And I think the courts have been weakened in a way that's not. And I'm a strict constructionist. I don't think district court federal judges should be making broad judgments across the whole country. I think those should be made at higher levels of the court system, federal court system. So I'm not on the left. I'm on the right. There is a growing revolt of what's happening on the old traditional right. National Review. If you read National Review, they're being very critical of some of the things that are going on now.
And of course, there are attacks on judges going on in this country, both rhetorical attacks, which is one thing, but also threats, physical threats to judges on both sides. And that's deeply concerning. And one of the things I'm worried about also is it's going to make it more difficult to recruit good people as judges when they are looking at the risks that they are facing. And that has the potential, if we don't have good judges, we're going to be undermining our entire democracy as well.
And that's true for all other sectors as well. The people running for office, there's a change in the character of the people on both sides, I might add. They tend to be more extreme in their rhetoric and the proposals they're making. There's more demagoguery on the left and the right in the United States, in my view, and that's not good for the American people. And the great bulk of the American people are actually left and right of center. They're not in the far right or the far left, and they're not going to have choices. And what I mentioned, Crane Britton's book on the anatomy of revolution. One of the things that happens during these revolutions is the moderates, the centrists, the people who govern, lose interest in politics, and that's very dangerous because then you leave it to the extremists.
So what can we do?
Well, the first thing we should do, in my view, is work on the political parties because that's one of the problems. The people who are being nominated are not the people, at least now. They're of a different character, different personality type than who were nominated before. There are very responsible people. I don't want to go through a list of them because I will embarrass them by saying so. In both parties who work together and more bipartisan. And they're getting threatened. And I do think if you think your congressman or senator is doing a good job and is responsible and is avoiding extremes, you ought to write to them and tell them that. You ought to go see them. You ought to write letters to the editor. I'm not one for a lot of demonstrations, to be very frank with you. But I think voting in primaries is maybe the most important thing you can do. Because if we nominate the wrong people in both parties and people don't really have a choice, then they're not going to vote at all.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew Natsios. Really appreciate your sharing your perspectives and your time with us. And thank you also for your service and your leadership, and really appreciate your insights.
Thank you for inviting me.